You're totally welcome to record it. I'm
Okay.
happy to be here.
Okay, perfect. So everyone, if you could just use the Q&A chat, because the actual chat box will be disabled, and Alexa and I will bring voice to the questions as we go through. The session will be recorded, and then any available materials that we have will be sent out after the session. So, April, I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I am a registered dietitian and personal trainer and have been for about 10 years. And I have been working for the Center for Community Health and Prevention through the University of Rochester for about 9 years. So the vast majority of my career has been here. I love where I am, what I do, and I love doing community presentations like this. So like I said, I'm very happy to be here. My typical presentation style is actually very conversational. So yes, I do have content, I do have slides, and I'll be sharing them with you. But I love discussion and I love getting questions. And with a kind of lunch and learn style presentation like this, I realize that everyone is coming to it from a totally different background. And so you might have very different ideas of what you were hoping to get out of this talk on, what's trending in nutrition than what I had prepared. So, like I said, feel free to ask questions because um, my real objective is for you guys to get out of this, what you came here for. So hopefully I'll leave time at the end. And then even if there's questions that maybe don't directly relate to this topic that I've chosen, I'd be happy to field those questions. So feel free to send those in the chat and then Brianna will help to get those questions across to me. Um, so that being said, as I was thinking about what it is trending in nutrition, there was a lot of different topics to draw from because there's always a lot going on in the field of nutrition. But what I chose to focus on today was the topic of intermittent fasting and meal timing because I get a lot of questions about that. And I think there's been a lot of talk and you know, anecdotal reports around intermittent fasting and what it does for the body for a long time, and not as many studies. And we're still in a place where there could certainly be a lot more research to be done. Um, but we have started seeing some research come through. So I'll share the results of one of the more recent studies and we'll kind of talk through like what is intermittent fasting and some different perspectives on it. So, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. I hope everyone can see this okay. So, we're going to be talking about intermittent fasting, heart health, and nutrition takeaways. So, the majority of this presentation was actually developed by one of my coworkers, Jill Chodak, who's also presented for Health Bites. I added some stuff in here, so you're getting, the perspective of two very seasoned dietitians here. So I mentioned that I work for the Center for Community Health and Prevention, and I just want to share a little bit more about what we do because anytime you receive a message about a different health intervention, that message is always going to be colored by the background of the clinician that's giving the information. So I wanted to share a little bit with you about what my background is as a dietitian and kind of how we work at the Center for Community Health and Prevention. So, here at our center, we have a very interdisciplinary team. We have 7 registered dietitians, 3 lifestyle counselors who focus on tobacco treatment. One of them is also a marriage and family therapist. We have 2 MDs on staff and an NP. So, we have a wide range of perspectives on our team. And our team really specializes in the use of self determination theory to provide patient centered, psychologically need supportive care. So that's a lot of terms and jargon, but what does that mean? Is that we come from a very holistic perspective, right? So I put this little wheel on the side to show all of the different things that we think about in our practice. someone's physical needs, their mental needs, spiritual needs, emotional needs, social needs, and their environment that they live in. And we believe that you can't separate these things from a person. They're all part of a person. And so um, if you're meeting one need at the expense of another, it's not going to offer that patient a high quality of life. So when we are counseling, our main goal is to integrate all of these elements of care. And with the use of self-determination theory, it's to help support our patients' psychological needs. So we believe that patients will feel the most vital and the most energized to toward their health or to work on their health when their psychological needs are met. So our goal more so than prescribing a diet or prescribing a medication or getting a patient to do XYZ behavior, lifestyle change, more so than that is our goal, is the goal of helping patients meet their psychological needs and support their needs, particularly for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So we want patients to be making their own autonomous choices around their lifestyle and their health. We want to help them feel competent to make the changes and perform the behaviors that they want to perform. And we also want to help build their relatedness, both their relatedness with us and with others around them. So, that's just a little background on kind of where I'm coming from in evaluating some of the research and anecdotal evidence on intermittent fasting. So today, my hope is that you guys will kind of have an understanding of what is intermittent fasting. Maybe you guys have all heard of this before, or maybe it's a totally new topic, but you'll know a little bit about what is it, and you'll have an idea of some key takeaways from one of the most recent studies that came out on this topic that was published by the American Heart Association. Hopefully, you'll also have an understanding of how intermittent fasting can impact the heart and overall health. And you'll be able to utilize nutrition suggestions to support overall high quality of life, including a heart healthy diet and healthy lifestyle patterns. Um, okay, so what is intermittent fasting? Because honestly, these days it can mean a million different things. Research on fasting in general goes back a long, 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 long time, because humans have been fasting for a very long time for different reasons, including necessity, like back in their hunter-gatherer days. Sometimes people fast for religious reasons. Um, and a variety of other reasons, right? So humans have been fasting for a very long time, and there have been some studies that go back a while, but there are some more recent protocol that have been used specifically for their reported health benefits. And so, what are these protocols? So, there's kind of four that I just wanted to highlight. So, one protocol for intermittent fasting is called the alternate day fast, where you're actually fasting for 36 hours and then only eating for 12 hours, and that happens on a cycle of every 2 days. So basically, you fast for an entire day, go to bed, continue fasting, and then you wake up and you eat that day like as you normally would. And then the whole next day you fast. So it's basically like one day of eating, one day of fasting, one day of eating, one day of fasting. That's an ongoing basis. That's one of the protocols that's out there. Another one is called Eat, Stop, Eat. And this is a full day fast where you fast for the entire day for 1 to 2 days per week, every week. So maybe it's like every Thursday you fast. There's another one called the Warrior Diet, which is a 4 hour feeding window and a 20-hour fast, and that's every single day. And then another one, the Lean Gains protocol, in which there's a 16-hour fast and an 8 hour feeding window, and that's every day. So hopefully, one thing you might be, hopefully, you're already feeling a little bit overwhelmed, as you should be. And one of the things I want to highlight here is the difficulty in finding good research and good data, because intermittent fasting does not mean the same thing to different people. There's so many different protocol um, for which it can be used. And so building up a cohesive body of literature on this topic is quite difficult. But those are just some of the protocols that are out there. So the idea with intermittent fasting is that there is a um, scheduled period of fasting followed by eating, and that can happen in different time amounts. But that's the consistent thing is these scheduled periods of fasting and eating. So I would say in my practice, what folks come to me asking about and what they're already doing, and just kind of my anecdotal judgment is that what's most popular right now is the lean gains, 16-hour fast and 8-hour feed, and that's every day. So that could look like waking up, skipping breakfast, then you start eating at noon and you finish eating at 8. I would say that's the most common protocol among folks that I know who are doing this protocol. So the American Heart Association actually released a study that looked at what happens when folks do intermittent fasting, and they looked at that lean gains protocol. So this was a study that included 20,000 adults, and they followed these adults. It was an observational study. So they were looking at what are these adults doing? When are they having their meals? And looking at their health outcomes. And they followed these participants for a length of 8 to 17 years. Okay, so it was a relatively long-term study, and the average age of the participants was 49 years. And again, they were really singling out folks who were kind of doing that 8-hour time-restricted eating window and then fasting for 12 to 16 hours in the day. Um, So, unfortunately, what they found in this study was that adults following the intermittent fasting had a 91% increase risk of death from heart disease. So, this was obviously a concerning outcome. And it's the study is kind of gaining momentum because it's kind of contrary to all these reports that we see, anecdotal and otherwise, of patients having, potentially positive health outcomes from intermittent fasting. So it's kind of like, what's the deal? What's going on here? Um, and Notably down here, intermittent fasting did not reduce overall risk of death from any cause. Okay, so piques your interest, right? It's like, oh no, there's actually like a potential harm here. So we want to understand this a little bit better. So there's a lot of things to note in this study in terms of limitations and considerations. One thing to note is that so far only the abstract has been released. So the American Heart Association was excited enough about it that they released the abstract, but we don't have all of the other details um, on this study yet in terms of the methods used and things like that. Okay, but some things that stick out to me as a dietitian was they assessed only 2 days of self-reported data at a time, right? So that can be super accurate or it can be not so accurate depending on who's reporting the data, right? We don't always have the most objective understanding of what we're eating. And sometimes a 2 day period might be pretty indicative of our norms, or a 2 day period might also not be very indicative of our norms. So I would say that's a limitation. The study also didn't factor in nutrition related differences in these groups and how that could impact heart health and overall health. I think this is a really important one to think about because one of the um, one thing that draws people to intermittent fasting a lot of the time is the fact that it's a protocol that's all about timing And it doesn't say anything about nutritional quality of our meals. So a lot of proponents of this diet, they say, well, you're going to get all of these benefits just because of the fasting and the timing. So you can kind of eat, whatever you want within that eating window as long as you're fasting in the fasting window. Um, but as a dietitian, I see the limitations of that, right? Like what you eat, the nutritional quality of what you eat, whether or not you're eating a nutritionally complete diet, that always is going to matter, right? And this being a study that was observational means this could have essentially been a study of folks who are just too busy to have breakfast, right? Not necessarily folks who were aiming to improve their health, right? And how we actually follow this, like what you eat, really does make a big difference. So there could have been some confounding variables here where maybe the timing could have had some benefit, but maybe it was outweighed by the lack of meeting some of the basic nutritional needs, if that makes sense. And we're going to come back to that idea in a little bit, but I think that was a significant limitation. Um, their overall takeaway was intermittent fasting may have a short-term benefit, but long-term adverse effects, right? So the short-term benefit might be like some weight loss, but then it didn't actually improve long-term mortality and increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Um, so that's a little bit about what I think are kind of some of the most important limitations. Um, Alexandra and Brianna, feel free to just pipe up if anyone's putting questions in the chat because I know these are some technical the technical studies that we're talking about and technical protocols. So yeah, are there any
Yes.
questions
If
so far?
Nope, nope. If anybody does, we will certainly, politely
Interrupt
interject.
me.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, yes. And bring voice to the questions. But no, nothing as of yet.
perfect. Sounds great. All right. So Um, all right. So now I mentioned that intermittent fasting really is only thinking about the meal timing. So what is a dietitian going to consider, right? When we're working with an individual patient and we're thinking through what is the eating pattern that's going to be best for this patient to meet their health goals and overall offer the highest quality of life. Of course, we're thinking about timing. That's one of the things. We're also thinking about their overall nutrition, right? Does the eating pattern meet their basic nutritional needs? We all have a certain amount of protein needs. We need a certain amount of calories. We need a certain amount of vitamins and minerals. So, of course, we're thinking about that. We're also thinking about, does the patient have any particular barriers to meeting those needs, right? So a patient with like GI issues, they might not be absorbing all their nutrition and there might be additional considerations there. Um, we're going to think about the foods that are eaten or restricted. So some patients might not be able to eat a certain variety of foods because of medical restrictions or allergies, or even preferences, right? Like people don't like every single food in the world sometimes. So that's a very real part of working with real people. We're thinking about hydration and what elements of nutrition are coming from your different sources of hydration, whether it be water, juice, alcohol, soda. We're thinking about movement and the patterns of movement. We're thinking about sleep and how that fits into all this. Sleep is a huge part of hormonal regulation, and we're going to come back to that idea of hormonal regulation. And patients can have a lot of barriers to sleep, and that can affect all of these other things in the wheel here. Um, if you're not getting good quality sleep, a lot of times you might be exercising and changing your diet and it still feels like working with one hand tied behind your back because there's just this element that's missing. Um, we think about medications. So there's a lot of medications that have interactions with food. Some of those are listed here, or medications that will leave us at increased risk of deficiencies of certain nutrients. Um, and medications that cause metabolic fluctuations, right? I don't know if any of you guys have heard the term like obesogenic medications, but there are medications that cause weight gain. Um, we're thinking about those socioeconomic factors, right? What a patient's financial status is, are they having any other barriers towards their health and their environment or their living situation? And then, of course, we're looking at just their general medical history, right? All their diagnoses. And then, of course, like their emotional wellness, their mental health, trauma history. That's all going to play a role in the eating pattern too, right? So it kind of comes back to that wheel I showed in um, the first slide where it's like, these are all of the things that a good dietitian will be thinking about. It's not just that one element of timing. So Alexandra, I see you popped in.
Yes,
Is there a question?
yes. I don't know if this is will fit here or if we wanted to wait and answer this later, but I didn't want to ignore this question. And I'm going to butcher this word to the point where I actually had to Google it. And it says, could you also talk a little bit about the auto, then it's spelled PHAGY effects everyone has been talking about?
Oh yeah, autophagy. So
I don't
um
know if that fits in with this as well. Want to answer it later.
yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So some of the uh, reported benefits and that we see in some of the research is that there's the theory or proposition that fasting or intermittent fasting can help with the cell life cycle. So cells dying when they're supposed to die. You're right, like just how humans have a life cycle, our cells kind of have a life cycle. And so if that life cycle is not going according to plan, we can actually accumulate some metabolic abnormalities or metabolic stressors. And so autophagy, I believe, is that idea of the programmed cell death. And so keeping that basically happening on the timely basis that it's supposed to be happening. I don't know a ton, other than what I just described on that particular benefit. I think like any theory, so a lot of times in the world of health and nutrition, we see a mechanism, right? We see like maybe a metabolic pathway that suggests that this intervention would lead to this health benefit. The problem with the looking only at a mechanism is it doesn't tell us the big picture. There could be other mechanisms that are also at play. So yes, maybe intermittent fasting helps with this timely programmed cell death and this idea of autophagy. But it there might be other things going on that when we look at the whole picture, we don't see the overall health benefit, if that makes sense. So like this study, this was observational, right? So it had other limitations, but one of the things that was a strength of the study was that it did look at overall mortality and kind of overall quality of life measures, which is at the end of the day, I would argue the most telling outcomes, if that makes sense. So, like I said, that's definitely, I haven't seen a ton of research in that particular area. So, I want to acknowledge that what I just gave was an inadequate answer in terms of really being able to speak to that and the potential benefits and limitations. I do think there is a mechanism there that's very promising, but we just need research to put it in the perspective of what other mechanisms are also happening at the same time and what do those what does the overall outcome look like. So I hope that that at least answered it a little bit or put it into a little bit of perspective, and I apologize for the lack of data that I have on that particular piece of this puzzle. But yeah, please let me know if there was a follow-up question. I'm happy to come back to it later. Okay. So just to kind of, highlight some of these concepts that we've been talking about, right? Like intermittent fasting really in and of itself as its own protocol, it does not take into account a lot of factors. It only takes into account the timing. So this is a very realistic eating pattern that we kind of developed from reports that we hear from our patients all day long of what they eat with their busy schedules and they're doing their absolute best, right? So this follows the lean gains protocol of eating in that 8 hour window, maybe start at 12 p.m. And eating at 8 p.m. There's a lot of like reliance on pre-prepared foods or, restaurant foods in this meal plan. And so we got, a McDonald's bacon, egg, and cheese biscuit with a hash browns, Subway honey mustard chicken wrap for lunch, and it's kind of a late lunch, right? And then we have dinner, which is a Taco Bell meal with a drink. And so the totals here are about 2,000 calories. It comes to 32 grams of saturated fat and 16 grams of fiber. So, notably, from a heart health perspective, this meal is high in saturated fat and low in fiber. And together, that combination is going to promote higher cholesterol levels. So, the general recommendations for saturated fat are to limit saturated fat to either 7 or 10% of your daily calories, which is obviously varies depending on the number of calories that you're eating, but it tends to range from like 15 to 21 grams a day. So this particular eating pattern is significantly higher in the saturated fat. And then, like I said, it's lower in the fiber. Our fiber needs are about 25 grams a day for women to 38 grams per day for men. And we like to call that's the human range, right? Some women need more than 25, some men need less than 38, but the human range is at least 25 to 38 grams of fiber. One of the things that fiber does is it will bind to any cholesterol in the meal. And when it binds to the cholesterol, it prevents it from getting absorbed. So that's one way that fiber helps keep cholesterol levels low and helps to promote heart health. So as dietitians, we're always trying to think about how to get more fiber in our meals. It also helps prevent a lot of other chronic diseases through other mechanisms. Um, right. So what is this? What are some of the variables that are not considered here, right? All these things, exercise, sleep, hydration, like this is not a comprehensive lifestyle management strategy. This is just a meal timing strategy. So some additional considerations. It can be socially restrictive, right? If you're trying not to eat at a certain time, and there's maybe a social engagement going on at that time, it can be socially restrictive and joy and relieving stress with friends in a social setting is important both for emotional and for physical health. Um, it can be nutritionally restrictive. Like most people, if you're doing intermittent fasting in any capacity, end up eating less, no matter how hard you try, because it actually down regulates your appetite. One of the main benefits that's kind of proposed is that when your body is in the fasted state, it's relying more on using fat for energy. And when we're relying more on fat for energy than carbohydrates, we tend to be less prone to like the blood sugar ups and downs. So in someone who's eating more regularly and their body is consuming fats and carbohydrates, a mix of those things for energy all the time, they're going to feel, when the blood sugar goes down, they're going to feel hungry. And so when you're relying mostly on fats, you don't get that appetite cue, that signal that you might otherwise get. So it is hard when as a benefit, a lot of people hear that and they think, oh, that's great. I'm trying to lose weight, so I'm trying to eat less. Um, the downside is that when we eat less, our body's very responsive. So this whole idea of calories in, calories out for weight management is actually quite tricky because how many calories your body burns, right? How many calories out, let's say, it's not fixed. So if you're eating less, your metabolism does slow down because your body does not want to lose a lot of weight on an ongoing basis. That wouldn't be healthy, right? You would end up with malnutrition. So our body is very smart to protect against that. Um, so with intermittent fasting, that eating less can offer some, as the study showed, the short-term benefits, right? You might lose a little bit of weight, but then over time, if we continue to not eat enough, um, the body's metabolism will slow down and weight management will actually get more difficult. Um, so that is definitely something to think about. And um, among my patients that have experimented with intermittent fasting, that appetite suppression can be significant. So I do have patients that they end up feeling like, oh, I really only need to eat one meal a day. I don't get hungry for the other meals. And I say, whoa, that might feel like a relief, but that's actually not healthy. It's going to lead to malnutrition and calorie or metabolism slowdown. So, yeah, there are some pros and cons there. And of course, if you're eating less, you're going to get less fiber, less vitamins, less minerals, less protein. We got to think about the emotional health and where it says sometimes an eating disorder trigger, right? Everyone has different experiences with food restriction, and that means different things to different people. And restricting food is not healthy for everyone. It can be unsustainable sometimes, and we'll come back to that idea and what might make it unsustainable. Um, Unproven claims, right? So I do think there's mounting research. So we're gonna have answers soon enough. But there is also a lot that is not known at this point. So the data I would say is very back and forth. Some of it's very positive, and then some of it, like this American Heart Association study, offers some challenges that we have to think through. And another thing to think about is like there's alternatives. Meal timing is not the only way to think about um, a healthy eating pattern, right? We have other well-researched eating pattern protocols. The Mediterranean diet is one of them and doesn't also necessarily have to include Mediterranean food. I think that's a common misconception of the diet is that like you have to eat Greek food all the time. That's not the case. Um, but there's lots of alternatives, right? Yeah, Alexandra, is there another question?
Yes, there is. So even though I feel like eating Greek food, in my opinion, all the time sounds wonderful.
Would be wonderful. Some of
Yes.
us,
Yes. So the question is, how do you suggest we keep one's metabolism up? In that case, would having maintenance calories every once in a while and not fasting help for weight management?
yeah. So the best ways to support a healthy metabolism are, I'm going to list them and you guys are going to be mad at me because some of them are like, you've heard them a million times. But truly, getting enough sleep, managing stress, staying hydrated, um, moving. I think that's a big thing that most Americans are missing, is moving. And then also the strength training. Even among Americans that are moving regularly and incorporating some physical activity, a lot of times we really tend to focus just on cardiovascular exercise. Um, and there are huge benefits for the metabolism of doing strength training because if we can build lean muscle mass, that muscle mass is very metabolically active. So it'll burn calories for us all the time. Um, so, incorporating that physical activity, and if you're not already doing it, incorporating some strength training about twice a week is usually what's recommended, at least twice a week. And then with nutrition, the best way to support metabolism is to eat enough to meet our nutritional needs. A lot of times we get this messaging that is, like I said, so focused on the calories in, calories out, and um, if you want to increase your metabolism or you want to lose weight, you have to eat less and move more. And then sometimes we end up actually over restricting and not supporting our metabolism. So to support the metabolism, you want to meet your nutritional needs, and that might require working with a dietitian, right? Like, how much protein do I actually need, or how many calories is enough? Those are questions that are going to have different answers for everyone. But you want to create a diet that's nutritionally complete and pair that with movement. And I feel like there's one other thing I was going to say about nutrition. Oh, if you do, like, if someone has a goal of weight loss, we do need to create a calorie deficit somehow. So the trick is to not create a deficit that's too big. So conventional advice was always like, it's okay to lose 1 to 2 pounds a week. In my clinical practice of 9 years and seeing literally thousands of patients, I've never seen 2 pounds a week be sustainable. But people always hit a plateau and then their metabolism slows down because that's 1,000 calorie deficit um, a day that you need. And like a 2,000 calorie diet is like an average diet. So that's a very big percentage, right? To be in a deficit of our daily intake. So um, I always recommend to my patients, you might want to create some calorie deficit, but you never want to create one that's bigger that you're consistently losing more than a pound a week. And a lot of times, cycling between periods of focusing on weight loss and then periods of focusing on weight maintenance can be very helpful as well. Because, as I'm going to talk about in a second, losing weight and being in a calorie deficit, right? So I said a lot of people who, when they intermittent fast, their calorie intake goes down whether they want it to or not. Being in a calorie deficit is a state of metabolic stress on the body. It doesn't want to be there in the long run. And if it is there for too long, problems happen. So if a lot of times if someone is like focusing on losing weight or creating that calorie deficit, we want to pair it with intentional plateaus so that your body can have some rest from that metabolic stress that weight loss is. Yeah, so I hope that answered the question a little bit.
Yes, that was wonderful. And there isn't another question, but I know you mentioned, kind of the interactive piece. And this is, I heard your health bites last year and I
Oh,
just praised you because I think this is so important because you're right. We get so many mixed messages. And one of my first jobs as a social worker was I worked at an eating disorder clinic. And I think this message is just, I'm so grateful for this, that it's really
oh, good.
focusing on the positive health changes and instead of the very restricted eating and some of these, kind of the last health weights was on like fad diets, right? And it's like, oh my gosh, growing up in the 90s or 2000s with a slim fast, right? And just all of these, right? Like all of these
Yes.
different mixed messages that we're getting, and to be able to hear your experience and the thousands of patients that you worked with and also the data behind it is huge because I think this is so culturally ingrained in us, the nutrition and the weight loss and the look a certain way, that
Yeah.
it's so important to have this background information to know, and what's going to work for us isn't, myself isn't going to work for you, right? Or the other people that are on this call, and to be very specialized. And so I just wanted to say, especially with that, last question and just the calorie deficit, and you mentioned the restriction and could also lead to eating disorders. I just so, wanted to say that I so appreciate you bringing up the just kind of like the health at every size, and
Mhm.
so I just appreciate that. So that's all. That was my
Yeah.
humble interjection, and I'll be quiet now for everybody
No, 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 you're
who's
good. You're
watching.
good.
But
You're good.
I'm this is just a topic that I feel passionate about as well, because there's just a lot of negative messages out there, and I think these are so important to hear a
Yeah.
professional say, you know, what what could be better for us. So thank you.
Yeah. 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 It's my pleasure. And, you know, the concept of weight in general, I mean, I could do a whole talk just on that and like limitations of using weight as a health marker. Like, yeah, I do think it has its place as one piece of data, but a lot of times we just make it the be all end all. Like, like that's your diagnosis, too much weight, you need to go fix that. And there's so many other pieces of this puzzle that are give a better picture of our overall health. So, even for someone who is wanting to lose weight, I have a whole conversation with them around why are you wanting to lose weight? Like, what are the important
Mhm.
outcomes here? Why is the weight a problem? So it's a whole thing. But yeah, happy
Absolutely.
to
No,
get into
yes,
it.
I appreciate that. But we do have a question, and I'm surprised in the comments it's not like Alexa, stop talking. The question is, what about if you're on GLP-1? Is 1 to 2 pounds lost per week okay?
Yeah. So that could also be its own talk. And it's a great question. And I would say it like all of these things, and I'm gonna get a little bit too more how this is individual. I realize I'm listing here a lot of limitations of intermittent fasting. That doesn't mean that it's wrong for everyone, right? Like a good dietitian is going to be looking at the individual in front of them and making individual choices. So, is more rapid weight loss is very common with the GLP-1 agonists. In some ways, that's to be expected because of the metabolic changes that it causes, but it still can present a problem. And it's still something that a lot of my patients on those GLP-1 agonists, we actually try to slow the weight loss in the beginning because one of the most common things that I see with those medications is malnutrition. So similar to kind of intermittent fasting, right? It brings your appetite down and in a really, really powerful way because it influences the brain's reward like signaling pathways. So some patients who of mine who are on the GLP-1 agonist, they lose all interest in food. So they could very easily eat one meal a day and they're not necessarily meeting their protein needs. And a lot of times they feel so relieved just to not be thinking about food all the time. That's one of the patients that benefits from these medications is those who have that food noise. I don't know if you guys have ever heard that term, but when you just feel like you're thinking about food all the time, it can feel like a huge relief to not be thinking about food all the time. But we still have to meet our nutrition needs. So I would say generally, we still want to aim for that 1 pound a week, even if you're on the agonist, but there are additional considerations. And still, even if you're on the agonist and the medication is like the intention of it is to lose weight, not eating enough can still be a problem. Um, so yeah. So moving on. So I just want to throw up, I'm not going to go into this in detail because I want to leave some more time for questions. I have a couple other slides. But this is an idea of like a Mediterranean diet, eating pattern, that I'm not going to say that's recommended by a dietitian, right? Like everyone is going to have a different eating pattern, but this is one, individual eating pattern that could work. And all of these factors on the side were taken into account, right? So, we are including dessert. We are including like restaurant meals and fast food. We got Panera in here, Core Life, the Wegmans. So it's not like, oh, you have to cook everything from scratch. You can never have convenience foods. You can never have anything that's like high in sodium. Um, this is an individualized diet that we developed with an individualized patient to take into account a variety of needs. So again, I'm not recommending everyone eats this or anything, but just an example of how, a dietitian will think about timing, but they'll also think about nutritional needs and the patient's need for convenience and all of these kind of factors. Um, so this is just kind of another slide that like illustrates all those things that dietitians are thinking about. So I did want to offer a couple slides from a presentation that I attended as part of a personal training conference. So I was getting continuing ed credits for my personal training certificate. And I attended a webinar that was all about intermittent fasting, separating fact from fiction. And it was the presenter was a PhD CPT, so PhD who also had their personal training certificate, and they had a lot of experience working with clients. This particular person follows the lean gains protocol himself, and he regularly uses intermittent fasting with his clients. But at the end of his presentation overall was very pro intermittent fasting. But then at the end of it, he had a couple slides that I thought were very interesting. And it was, from his clinical experience, right, the many patients that he's worked with, what's his clinical judgment on who does intermittent fasting generally work for and who does it not work for? Um, and I thought, like I said, this was interesting. So, who does it work for? Those who have a history of monitoring calories and food intake. So, a lot of the examples that he gave of like his clients when they were doing intermittent fasting was highly regimented in many other ways, right? So it wasn't like loosey goosey, eat whatever you want, but just eat at these times. It was nothing like that. They were weighing out their protein. It was very regimented in a lot of other ways. And they were aiming for very specific outcomes, right? Some of them were athletes or other things like that. He says this tends to work well for people who are single or don't have children because there's with meal timing and the social emotional needs, children and spouses can provide a lot of barriers to being like, I'm just not going to eat between these hours, right? It tends to work well for those who are experienced with physical activity and kind of know how their body reacts to physical activity in the fasted and non-fasted state, and they kind of know nutritionally what their body needs for the type of physical activity that they're doing. It works when you have an extremely supportive partner, right? Coming back to that social piece. If your family isn't on board, and they're eating when you're not eating, it can be very challenging. Those are the flexible job and lifestyle. He mentioned that he himself, he does this lean gains protocol, and he will actually schedule his work calls around his fasting periods so that he doesn't have to interact with others while he's fasting. So obviously for many people, we can't do that. We have to interact with people when our job says we need to interact with people, and we can't always, move those puzzle pieces. And then also those with low lifestyle stress. So I mentioned that being in a calorie deficit and fasting, just that fasting period, is a state of metabolic stress to some extent. And there are lots of other sources of stress in our lives and other sorts of both emotional and oxidative or like metabolic stress. So, emotional stress chronic emotional stress can increase cortisol levels. Exercising is a source of oxidative stress. Exercising causes inflammation. It's the periods of rest and recovery between our exercise periods that we get the benefit. It's not actually from the exercise, it's from the recovery phase. So, if we're exercising a lot, if we're have a lot of stress, the fasting may potentially, like our body might not be able to deal with the metabolic stress that causes. So people with flexible jobs, low lifestyle stress, single or no children. So who is this describing? It's describing young men. Okay. And this is what he said. And he was a young man himself. He said the vast majority of clients that this works for is young men who meet all these criteria. Okay. Who does it not work for? Those who are new to diet and exercise. And honestly, like, kind of colloquially or culturally, like the vast majority of people who come to me wanting to experiment with intermittent fasting are new to diet and exercise. They say, I heard about this thing and I'm looking to lose weight and I want to try this, but they don't necessarily have an established eating pattern or consistent eating patterns or a consistent exercise pattern. Those who are married and have children, those who have performance-oriented jobs, right, where we need to be high performing at specific times of the day, those who have client-facing jobs, those who compete in elite sports and athletics, right, so where you're burning a very large amount of calories, just that calorie deficit it's hard to eat enough calories when you're doing so many sports and athletics. Those with excessive lifestyle stressors, and also women. So he said in general, um, in his, like I said, with his clinical judgment, his anecdotal experience, intermittent fasting works for about 20% of women, whereas about 80% of young men. So I think there's a lot of reasons why this is the case, right? Um, but one of them is just the hormonal differences between women and men. Um, there are a lot of hormonal differences, and um, some of those differences have to do with like circadian rhythms. So eating is a huge part of regulating our circadian rhythms. I'm gonna actually have a slide on that here, right? So this is a slide from the NIH that is looking at some of the different things that happen throughout the day and also like metabolically what happens, right? So these are all things that our body is doing as it's preparing to consume food during this wake time. And here are all the metabolic things that are going on during sleep and fasting time. And so our food actually plays a big role in establishing our circadian rhythms. And when I attended this webinar, one of the things he talked about was that the way he was introduced to intermittent fasting was actually as part of a jet lag protocol. So intermittent fasting was proposed, a very specific protocol, not one of the ones that I mentioned, but a very specific protocol for how to resolve your jet lag or how to prevent jet lag. Because this particular presenter, he traveled a lot for work, right, doing presentations, and he had horrible jet lag and he wanted to cure it. Um, and so that's just a testament to how strong of an impact our meal timing can have on our circadian rhythms. And I don't know if any of you have ever worked the night shift or have friends who have worked the night shift, but a lot of folks start to have metabolic challenges when they start working the night shift. I have lots of patients who say, I started working the night shift. I kept all my meals the same. I just ate them at a different time than normal. And I started gaining weight when I started working nights because these hormonal patterns are really disrupted and they're very strongly ingrained. Um, so it does seem like women are more susceptible to disruptions in the circadian rhythm. So if you are like signaling to your body that you're sleeping because you're fasting, but you're not really sleeping, that can cause hormonal disruptions. So that's thought to be part of the reason why women, like, we're a much more delicate hormonal we have a much more delicate milieu in the hormonal arena than men. But I mean, just in general, men and women aside, I look at this list, it's most Americans, right? Lots of Americans are married and have children. They have job stress. They need to perform for their jobs. So I just thought it was very interesting that even, while he does have his kind of group where he thinks, yeah, intermittent fasting can really be a good fit for these folks, he really acknowledged that there's a long list of people for whom it's not a good fit. And he will often, if folks come to him who are meet these criteria, he'll say, I just don't think it's going to be, we could try it, but I don't think it's going to be a good fit for you. So, I wanted to kind of bring that piece in that, like everything, it should be individual. So it's not necessarily that intermittent fasting is like bad for everyone, even though we focus mostly on its limitations. I think it can work for some, but it's good to have kind of a healthy understanding from someone with some clinical judgment on this is like, where does he see it being beneficial and where does he not see it being beneficial? So that is the end of my presentation. I know we only have 4 minutes left for questions, but just wanted to leave a little bit of time for that.
Sure, let's see what we have here. Somebody asked if the slides will be shared, and I did mention that since you agreed for this to be recorded, that we will have it up on our EAP website. So that will be up once we go through all the, hoops for the U of R to get stuff put on the website. So the other question we had is, She said, I may have missed this, but how important is it to maintain the same fasting schedule each day? She says she just travels to the West Coast, so with the time change, that it can be a challenge.
Yes. That certainly can be a challenge. And I think when you're regularly traveling between time zones, there's not necessarily one size, there's not like one prescription that will work. And I think it is a lot of trial and error. It would be interesting for you to look at that jet lag protocol because I do think there's some elements that could be helpful. Like um, another tip that I've received from just my friends who travel a lot, they say like when you're traveling, when you get to your destination in the other time zone, stay awake until it's bedtime in that time zone. Like do whatever you can to stay awake until it's bedtime in that time zone and then go to sleep. And that kind of resets things. And so I do think there could be kind of some element of that could work for the eating pattern as well, like kind of trying to get on the eating schedule. Um, of the time zone that you're in that could like help with kind of keeping the circadian rhythms copacetic. Um, but I think it might be worth like working with a professional individually to also help you through like maybe your body actually wouldn't agree with that. Maybe there would be too long of a fasting window in that you need a little high protein snack or something, but then keep, work on the meal timing. So I know that wasn't a very uh concrete answer, but hopefully it helped in terms of like how to think about it, maybe.
Yes, absolutely. And I feel like we always get the question of how would individuals contact you or, contact if they wanted some kind of appointment or maybe more resources or information? What does that look like?
Yeah. So you can call my office and the phone number is 585-602-0720. So we're the Healthy Living clinical programs part of the Center for Community Health and Prevention. And we have 7 dietitians and, myself and Jill, who
Mhm.
both contributed to this presentation are, both on staff, but all of our dietitians are also, um, versed in intermittent fasting and can answer questions about that and help, with general healthy eating.
Well, thank you so much. I hope you get a lot of people reaching out to you, not too overwhelming, but just people who were
The right
fascinated
amount of
by
people.
this. I don't know. I'm such a dork. I'm like over here taking notes. And like I said, the last one that you hosted was just, it was incredible. So we're so grateful for you. Thank you
Mm,
so much for spending an hour with us and all this wonderful information. And thank you to everybody who joined and was hopefully able to eat lunch and just kind of, relax for an hour. Now we all get to go back to our crazy days. And thank you so much. Thanks
yeah.
everybody for
Thank you so much for
coming.
having me. It's always a pleasure.
Of course. Yes. Well, have a great day.
Yeah, you too.
All right. Bye, everyone.